The cell door creaked open just before dawn. He had not slept. Sleep was for those who believed in tomorrow, and George Stinney Jr. had long stopped believing in that. The concrete beneath his feet had chilled his bones for 81 nights. He had memorized the sound of rats beneath the floor, the taste of stale air, the exact number of cracks in the wall above his cot. There were 5. He had counted them every morning like prayers whispered without hope. When the guards entered, they did not speak. They had spoken too much already, too loudly, too often in courtrooms and in whispers behind locked doors. Now there was only duty, the kind of duty that pretends to be justice. George was 14 years old. The shackles were made for men. They clinked awkwardly around his thin wrists. His hands trembled not from fear but from something colder, inevitability. He walked between them like a ghost in a borrowed body, his bare feet slapping the stone in rhythm with the heartbeat he could no longer feel. They brought him into the chamber as the sun began its slow rise, golden light bleeding through a narrow slit in the wall. But nothing about this place was warm. The chair stood waiting, a thing built for death, not justice. Too large, too ancient, too permanent. They had to place a Bible on the seat to raise him high enough. The irony did not bother them. Perhaps it never occurred to them at all. They strapped him down with leather worn by dozens before him. Wrists, chest, ankles. His head disappeared beneath the mask, rough, black, wide at the seams, swallowing the face of a child whose voice had never truly been heard. The signal was given. And then, silence. Then, the switch. The jolt lifted his small frame as if it were paper. Smoke curled from beneath the mask. The room held its breath. Somewhere someone coughed. Another tightened their jaw, but no one looked away. Not really. And when it was over, when the air smelled of char and cloth, someone wrote the time of death on a clipboard. No funeral bell rang. No apology followed. The boy was gone, and South Carolina rose to a warm spring morning as though nothing had happened. They called it swift justice. They said the boy had confessed, and what more was there to say? The case, they insisted, was clear. The law had spoken, the town had peace. The girls had been buried, and now the boy who took them was buried too in ash, not earth. But justice has a way of hiding in shadows. And in Alcaloo, South Carolina, the shadows stretched long. What they did not say was that George Stinney Jr. was arrested without a warrant, that his family was forced from their home before they could speak to him, that his father was fired from his job at the mill and told to leave town or else, that George was interrogated for hours, alone without a lawyer, a parent, or even a witness. They did not tell you that his so-called confession was never signed, never written, that it existed only in the memory of a sheriff desperate for answers, that when the trial began it lasted barely 1 day, that his defense attorney, court-appointed, called no witnesses, not one, not even George. They did not mention that the jury was all white, that the courtroom was filled with white faces, white stares, white silences, that the deliberation took 10 minutes. 10. And in those 10 minutes a child's fate was sealed with the ease of signing a receipt. There was no cross-examination of the sheriff, no forensic evidence, no investigation into whether a 14-year-old boy weighing 95 pounds could have killed 2 girls, dragged their bodies and hidden them with no trace of struggle. The truth is not complicated, it is simply uncomfortable. George Stinney Jr. was not executed because the evidence was overwhelming. He was executed because the town needed closure, because 2 white girls were dead, because the line between justice and vengeance had blurred into something far more dangerous, and because George was black. This was not a trial. It was a ritual, a sacrifice to fear clothed in the language of the courts. The myth they sold was clean, quick, legal. The truth was bloodless on paper and soaked into the soil beneath a prison wall. George Junius Stinney Jr. was born in 1929 in the Deep South, a place where the air was thick with humidity, pine, and an old fear that never spoke its name out loud. He was born into a country pretending not to be at war with itself, into a system already trained to crush him long before he could understand why. He lived in a segregated town called Alcolu, barely a speck on the map of South Carolina. It was a company town owned and operated by the lumber mill that employed most of the men, including George's father. White families lived on one side of the railroad tracks in painted houses with porches. Black families lived on the other side in shacks with warped floorboards, no plumbing, and windows that let in rain as easily as sunlight. These were not merely differences in housing, they were differences in humanity. Where you lived determined if your children would be protected. What you looked like decided if your cries for help would be heard. George was one of 5 children. He had a younger brother, Charles, and an older sister named Amy. His mother kept house. His father labored in the mill, rising before dawn to work under the same men who would later turn their backs. The family was tight-knit. They went to church. George attended school at the town's one-room black schoolhouse, where children shared textbooks from the 1920s and pencils sharpened with knives. He was quiet, not shy, but observant. He liked drawing. He liked flowers. He and his siblings would walk the dirt paths that ran parallel to the tracks, looking for wild maypops and listening for the whistle of distant trains. His hands were small, his voice still high with youth. He weighed just over 90 pounds. He did not yet know how to be afraid of the world. But the world was already afraid of him. Because in places like Alcolu, black children were not allowed to be children. They were threats, suspects, excuses. On March 23, 1944, the machine began its work. 2 white girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, were riding their bicycles through the area looking for maypops. They passed George and his sister as they stood near their home. A brief conversation, directions exchanged, the kind of innocent interaction that should have meant nothing. But when the girls did not return home that evening, the town's panic turned toward the familiar target. By morning, their bodies were found in a shallow ditch, battered and broken. A rusty railroad spike was rumored to be the weapon. There were no fingerprints, no blood trail, no eyewitnesses. But there was fear. And in towns like Alcolu, fear always demanded a name. George was taken into custody that same day. No warrant, no warning. He was pulled from his home, his family shoved aside. His father was fired and ordered to leave the town immediately. His mother was told nothing. His sister, who had been with him when they spoke to the girls, was never questioned. The police claimed George confessed that he admitted luring the girls into the woods, attacking them with a weapon, dragging their bodies into the ditch. But this confession was never recorded, never signed, never repeated by George. He would later say he was threatened, beaten, starved, terrified. But no one listened. The sheriff held a press conference announcing that the boy had confessed, and the town sighed with relief. The headlines followed: Negro boy confesses, child slayer jailed, justice for Betty and Mary. There was no trial yet, but the conviction had already taken place in newspapers, in whispers, and in the brittle smiles of people who refused to question what they wanted to believe. George was not sent to a juvenile facility. He was not given therapy, counseling, or even medical care. He was transferred to Columbia's Central Correctional Institution, an adult penitentiary with stone walls, iron bars, and the stench of old blood. He was placed in solitary confinement where the light barely reached the floor. He had no contact with his family. For nearly 3 months he sat in silence, waiting to die. No psychologist was ever brought in. No analysis of his age, his mind, his trauma. Because to the state of South Carolina, George was not a boy. He was a body, a placeholder, a convenient ending. When the trial date was set for June 16, 1944, it moved faster than any legal proceeding in the state that year. It took one day. The courtroom was packed with white townspeople. The all-white jury was selected in less than 2 hours. The defense attorney, Charles Plowden, was a tax lawyer with no experience in criminal defense. He was paid $5 for his services. He did not object to any evidence. He did not cross-examine the sheriff. He did not question the lack of physical proof. He did not call George to the stand. He did not ask for mercy. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes. 10. And then guilty. And then death. No appeal was filed. No motion to stay the execution. No petition for clemency. George Stinney Jr. was sentenced to die in the electric chair, the youngest person in modern American history to face state execution. But this was never about George. This was about power. The kind of power that does not need to speak loudly because it is everywhere. In the courtroom, in the sheriff's badge, in the silence of neighbors, in the headlines that forgot to ask questions, in the railroad tracks that cut through Alcolu like a scar dividing not just geography but humanity. This was the rise of a system. A system that had perfected its rituals, accusation, isolation, confession, execution. And beneath it all, the quiet machinery of white supremacy grinding forward unchallenged. George's name was simply the one written on the gears. Ready to proceed? You said. Yes. ChatGPT said, continuing with, the verdict echoed in a room already emptied of justice. Guilty. It hung in the air like smoke that would never clear. George turned his head, instinctively searching the courtroom for someone, anyone to reach for. But there were no outstretched hands. No mothers weeping. No father's resistance. Only cold eyes, folded arms, and the soft rustling of people rising from their benches as if leaving a sermon. No one told George what would happen next. He was led from the courthouse with chains around his wrists and ankles. Not even a man, just a boy in a second-hand shirt, his eyes wide with the kind of confusion that doesn't speak, that simply folds in on itself like a flower before a storm. Reporters snapped photographs of the child who would soon be burned alive by law. One of them chuckled when George tripped on the courthouse steps. Another scribbled down a headline before he even reached the police car. No one heard George speak, but a guard later claimed he asked quietly, "Does this mean I'm going to die?" The answer was already written. He was taken to Central Correctional Institution, a prison that had swallowed thousands. Stone walls 30 feet high, barbed wire weaved like veins. Inside, they put George in solitary confinement. His cell was 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, no window, just one bed bolted to the wall and a toilet that always ran. The lights buzzed overhead and never turned off. There was no clock, no calendar. The days dripped past like water from a rusted pipe, slow, irregular, endless. He was given 3 meals a day, slid through a hatch. Sometimes the food was cold, sometimes it wasn't food at all, just stale bread or watery soup. He rarely ate more than a few bites. His stomach hurt, his skin grew pale, his fingernails flaked. He had nothing to write with, nothing to read, no mirror, no voice, and no visits. The state denied his family access. Letters went unanswered, requests ignored. Even his pastor was turned away once. They said it was for his safety that angry mobs might descend if word got out, but in truth the state feared only one thing, that someone might see him and remember that he was just a child. Outside, the weeks rolled forward. June in South Carolina burned the sky with heat. The papers stopped printing stories about George. The townspeople moved on. Betty and Mary were buried. The town returned to its routine school picnics, church meetings, bake sales. Only the Stinneys lived in exile, scattered to different towns, whispering their grief in borrowed homes. Inside his cell, George began to talk to the walls. At first, only when the lights buzzed too loudly, then when the guards walked past, then all the time. Not madness, just desperation. The sound of his own voice was the only reminder he was still real. Sometimes late at night he would sing quietly, songs from church, songs his mother used to hum while stirring beans on the stove. The guards pretended not to hear. The date was set, June 16, 1944. The youngest person ever sentenced to death by electric chair in 20th century America was scheduled to die at 7:30 a.m. There was no appeal, no motion for clemency. His court-appointed lawyer had left town. When local ministers requested the execution be stayed, citing his age, the rushed trial, the flimsy evidence, the governor's office replied with a single sentence: "The law has spoken." In the days leading up to the execution, preparations were made with mechanical efficiency. The chair was tested twice, the voltage recalibrated, the straps cleaned. The Bible placed on the seat was wiped with a cloth soaked in oil. George was not told what would happen. No one explained the procedure. No one told him how the machine worked, how the mask would feel, or what to do when the time came. On the evening before the execution, he was brought a final meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and milk. He barely touched it. When the guards checked on him that night, they said he was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, humming to himself. At sunrise, they came for him. He was dressed in a loose-fitting shirt and trousers that didn't match. The guards avoided eye contact. One of them offered to carry him, but George shook his head. He wanted to walk. Or maybe he just didn't want to be touched. The hallway to the execution chamber was long. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally. Somewhere far away, a bird was singing. It was the first sound from outside George had heard in 81 days. When he entered the chamber, he blinked against the glare. Reporters stood against the far wall, pens poised. The chair stood in the center like a monument to something no one dared name. Death, revenge, racism. Whatever it was, it waited patiently. They helped him up. He was too small. They placed the Bible on the seat. He sat. The leather straps were pulled tight, one across his chest, another at his wrists, his legs. The mask, rough, black, thick with the scent of other men, was lowered over his face. For a moment, George disappeared completely. The switch was pulled, and the room became a place no child should have ever known. The execution chamber was small, too small to hold what it was about to witness. It smelled of old copper and disinfectant. The walls, once white, had taken on the color of breath held too long. The witnesses filed in, quiet as churchgoers, though there was no sermon here, just a chair, a switch, a child. George sat strapped to the chair in the center of the room, his limbs bound in leather, his back curved inward as if bracing for something too vast to name. His head covered with the thick black mask, its fabric trembling slightly with each breath he took. Beneath it, his eyes were wide open. He was not praying. He was not crying. He was listening to the sound of his own breathing and to the silence that surrounded it. There were 17 witnesses present. Officials, clergymen, reporters. 2 prison guards who had seen executions before and one who hadn't. The new man stood rigid in the corner, gripping his cap like it might anchor him. The warden stood near the lever. His hands did not tremble. He had done this before, but never to someone so young. They waited. At 7:29 a.m. the room was still. A hush fell, not demanded, but assumed the kind of quiet reserved for sacred acts and terrible decisions. Someone cleared their throat. Another scribbled into a notebook, then paused. There was nothing left to write. The executioner stood behind the curtain. The lever, when pulled, would send 2,400 volts of electricity into the chair into George in 3 pulses. The first was meant to kill, the second to be certain, the third to clean up what remained. No one spoke the procedure aloud. It had been practiced too many times to require narration. The warden gave the signal, and time collapsed. The first jolt hit George like a thunderclap swallowed by the bones. His body convulsed, slamming against the restraints. Smoke hissed from beneath the mask. The stench of burned cloth and scorched air filled the room. Someone turned away. Someone else dropped their pen. But no one stopped it. The second jolt came 15 seconds later. His body lifted again, not fully, just enough to make the chair creak. His fingers curled into fists. His shoes, too large for his feet, twitched against the floor. The guards stared straight ahead like statues. Then came the third. When it ended, the room did not breathe for a full 20 seconds. Only when the warden nodded did anyone move. A physician approached. He placed 2 fingers to the side of the boy's neck. Waited. Then checked the chest. No rise, no fall. He stepped back. Time of death, he said, voice low. 7:31 a.m. A guard wrote it down. The page trembled only slightly, and that was it. No one wept. No prayers were said. George Stinney Jr. had been executed by the state of South Carolina, the youngest person ever put to death by electric chair in the 20th century. 14 years old, 95 pounds, convicted in 10 minutes, buried in silence. They removed the mask. His face, burned and contorted, was no longer that of a child. It was something in between a memory undone, a portrait no one would hang. They carried his body to a small wooden cart and covered it with a linen sheet. There was no casket, no flowers. His family was not present. They had been told to stay away. Outside, the sky was clear. June sun warm against the roof of the prison. Somewhere down the road, a train passed, its whistle distant and indifferent. George's body was buried in an unmarked grave behind the prison. Later, his family retrieved him. They laid him to rest in the quiet earth, beneath a small wooden cross. It read only his name, no dates, no epitaph, as if the years had never belonged to him. The chair was cleaned, the straps replaced, the switch reset. By noon, the chamber was prepared for the next. And in that stillness, a ritual had been completed, not of justice, but of forgetting. Because executions in America are not just acts of punishment, they are acts of erasure. They remove not just the body, but the possibility of error, of guilt, of innocence. What mattered was that order had been restored. The town could breathe again. The headlines were satisfied. The governor could sleep. But somewhere in that little house behind the mill, in the hearts of those who remembered the way George used to pick flowers by the tracks, something had broken that would never be whole again. The state had not simply executed a boy. It had proven its power to define who counted and who didn't, who deserved a voice. There was no procession, no music, no carriages, no long black veils trailing behind women with handkerchiefs pressed to their lips. George's body was not carried down the steps of a church, nor followed by a priest intoning Latin over incense smoke. There were no photographs, no public grief, only dirt. After the execution, his body was taken to the prison yard and handed over like a misplaced package. A plain pine box, nails rusted, corners split. He had no suit, just the shirt he wore when he died, still marked by heat and struggle. His face, burned and misshapen, was covered with a cloth. The prison chaplain whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, for finality. The guards did not speak. The warden returned to his office. The paperwork was stamped. Somewhere beyond the prison walls, the Stinney family waited. They had been driven out of Alcaloo the day George was arrested. They received no explanation, no apology, only a quiet threat: leave or be buried next to him. They scattered. George's father found work in another mill 2 counties away. His mother stopped speaking in public. His siblings grew up with new names whispered into new towns, but none of them ever escaped the weight of that summer. They buried George in a churchyard far from the prison, a quiet place between 2 oaks. The funeral was attended by family and a handful of brave neighbors. There were no reporters, no markers, just hands in soil, voices trembling, a boy's name etched on wood that would rot within a decade. And then silence. Alcaloo moved on. The case was considered closed. The records were stored, boxed, shelved. The court reporters moved on to new trials. The governor to new re-election speeches. In textbooks, George's name never appeared. In history classes, he was never mentioned. The children of Alcaloo grew up passing the ditch where the girls had been found, but they were never told what had been buried beside it. For the Stinneys, life was a kind of exile, not just from home but from truth.